Red light, green light, the glass bridge, Russian roulette. Today we're ranking Squid Game character fates, gruesome to most gruesome. A quick note, Squid Game is a bloody show, so we'll be considering both the gruesomeness of these fates and how much the character actually deserved it. So we'll begin with the characters who deserved a way worse hand than they got. These guys got off too easy. While it may be a bit premature, we have to call out some of the less deserving survivors of Season 2's game thus far, starting with player 100, Im Jong-dae. To be at least somewhat understanding towards him, this guy is in the biggest debt we've seen in the show so far, owing $10 billion to various creditors. But regardless of the reasoning, he's one of the most insensitive and inhumane players in the series, openly devaluing human life by demanding the games continue until enough people die for him to repay his debts. The man is human garbage, and what does he get as punishment? Well, nothing. Like, absolutely nothing. Despite constantly manipulating the other contestants, pushing them around, and openly expressing a desire for as many of them to die as possible, he hasn't even faced a hint of comeuppance for his actions so far. Hopefully Season 3 will change that, but for now he's gotten a way easier ride than he deserved. Following him is Thanos' partner in crime, player 124, Nam-gyu. Nam-gyu is both crueler and more mentally sound than Thanos, who he acts as more or less of a sidekick to throughout the season. He also shared 100's desire for the games to continue regardless of the way they endangered numerous human lives. Despite this, he doesn't really face a ton of music for his actions, surviving due to the fact that he didn't join Gi-hun's revolt against the staff in episode 7. The only reason Nam-gyu is placed as our second lowest rather than the lowest is the fact that he's had to deal with the death of his admittedly recent friend, but considering how he wasted no time snatching the drugs he kept in his necklace, we think he's coping just fine. And what a sleazebag. Our next choice is not a contestant at all, but we had to give the Panther masked VIP a mention. The VIPs were the most uncomfortably horrific characters in the show, and this guy was the worst out of all of them. He openly devalued the lives of the contestants, took sadistic pleasure in their pain, and even resorted to sexually assaulting the workers during the show. This earned him a well-earned squeeze to the penis and testicles. Now, I don't doubt that was an incredibly painful experience, but since he gets his kicks out of others going through significantly worse trials and tribulations, I think he has a few thousand more nut shots to take before he's even remotely received justice. Rounding out this significantly shorter category is the deceptively lovable old man, player 1, Oh-il-nam. If episode 9 of season 1 just didn't exist at all, this guy's death would have easily been the saddest of the season, in our opinion at least. But what seemed to be an innocent, sweet old man turned out to be an absolute monster who sent undeniably thousands of vulnerable, struggling people to their deaths, all because he was bored. I don't even think Saul Goodman could make a case for why this guy's mental gymnastics supposedly makes sense. Despite all the suffering he put others through, Oh-il-nam got to spend his final days exactly how he wanted to, playing games with people to remind him of the innocent child he used to be. I'm not saying dying slowly from a brain tumor isn't a horrible way to go, and if it were anyone but him, we'd place him much lower on the list, but considering how much evil he did and how luxurious his final weeks of life were, we say that he still got off pretty darn easy. But that's just how it is, sadly. The most evil people can put up the most innocent fronts and get saved from their just desserts by money. These next characters weren't quite as lucky. They had to live with the consequences of their actions. We'll call this category the alive but traumatized characters. Up first we have player 125, Min-soo. Despite not being a villain or even an antagonist really, Min-soo is definitely the character who's getting the most hate thrown his way this season. And honestly, while I don't hate him, I can't say the hate is unwarranted. He did betray Semi, his only real friend in the games, twice, and the second time his inaction caused her death. But looking at him sympathetically, he at least tried to distract 124 by dropping a bottle near him, only to not follow through with protecting Semi or even helping her fight him off. I don't think Min-soo is a bad person, but he is a self-centered coward who's going to be dealing with guilt for the rest of his life. Oh, also, the guy's only 27? I thought he was like 19 at most from how he looked and acted, but no, he's just a wuss. But he's not an irredeemable one, which we will keep in mind. From one coward to another. Next up is player 388, Kong Dae-ho. This ex-marine was seemingly one of the most valuable assets to Gi-hun's revolt in episode 7, and despite shaking in fear, he did his best to fight alongside his friends. That was until he chickened out of returning the ammo-filled magazines to his allies. To be compassionate towards Dae-ho, it's clear that he's experiencing some sort of panic attack and maybe even PTSD, both of which would inhibit his judgment skills. But if Min-soo would have survivor's guilt for failing to save Semi, then I can't even imagine how indirectly causing multiple deaths would feel for Dae-ho, who has military experience. Although, to address the elephant in the room, a lot of fans have speculated that 388 is either lying about his involvement in the military or severely overstating his contributions. We can't treat this as fact since you know, it's not a confirmed fact yet, but it's definitely worth considering at the very least. For our next character, we have to go with Detective Jun-ho. In what has to be one of the absolute cruelest displays of irony in television history, Jun-ho spent the entirety of season 1 searching for his brother after he disappeared for years, only to find out after enduring constant terror, violence, and outright revolting stuff that his brother was the one running the very twisted games he'd discovered. What's worse is that after being shot point blank by his own brother, Jun-ho would eventually attempt to track down the games again, knowing fully well that his own brother was at the helm, but not knowing that he's in league with a traitor who's actively sabotaging his search for the island. Hopefully, Jun-ho will succeed and finally get the respect he deserves, but for right now, he's definitely got one of the toughest races to run out of all the living characters. Without further ado, player 456, Gi-hun, is next. Really, you can consider this the umbrella entry for pretty much everyone who's experienced the Squid Game and lived to tell the tale, which isn't exactly a lot of people, but still. You know what's worse than directly witnessing the deaths of 455 people, several of whom were your good friends, and living with the guilt? Coming home to find your mother dead in your own apartment. You know, this sick mother who was the main reason you joined the game in the first place? Yeah, that one. That's not to mention going back to the games again to desperately try and stop them, ultimately losing your best friend in the process and being forced to watch him die in front of you. He's experienced more loss in 2 one-week periods than most people will in their entire lives, and it's safe to say that Gi-hun is not gonna be the same person he once was. A fact the aforementioned best friend even went as far as to directly comment on. The only bright spot of his fate was the money he earned, which he has used for a lot of good causes so far, but after all that time, he still hasn't been able to see his young daughter again, who was another motivating factor for him joining the games. Gi-hun is surviving, but he is by no means thriving. We can only hope that season 3 will change that for him. But now it's time to get into the main course of the video. With no shortage of deaths to talk about, we'll begin with the instantaneous deaths. Picking up this category is player 324 from season 1. You'll probably remember him as the poor sap who got eliminated first due to not taking the game seriously. In his defense, he didn't really have any reason to think he needed to take a playground game seriously, which is our reason for placing him so low. You know how sometimes when you get a shot at the doctor, it hurts less when you don't know the needle is coming? That's what this death seems like. 324 had no clue of the danger he was in, and as he died, he just figured he was playing a silly game, only to find out that this game was in no way silly. Up next, we have player 396, Kang Mi-na from season 2. Like 324, she didn't really believe the games to be a legitimate danger to herself or anyone else. Although Gi-hun did warn them about the game's true nature, she, alongside most of the others, refused to believe him. But were it not Gi-hun, she'd find out for herself soon enough when Thanos told her a bee had landed on her, causing her to panic and become season 2's first elimination. While her death was just as instantaneous as 324's, Mina's hurt a little bit more just for the fact that she could have easily made it if it weren't for that bee. I have a feeling it's the true mastermind behind the games, but I digress. For now, let's move on to the final death that was visibly instant, the salesman. First and foremost, good riddance. This guy not only worked as a staff member on the Squid Games, but he was proud of his own cold-hearted nature, often playing games with whomever he got his hands on that would end in their deaths. Toying with Gi-hun would be his last mistake though. After trauma dumping for a few minutes, he pitched the idea of a game of Russian roulette, during which, to his credit, he fully respected the rules and put that bullet right in his own brain. Since he died instantly for obvious reasons, not to mention on his own terms, we have to say that his death, while immensely satisfying, was nowhere near as cruel as the ones his colleagues suffered year after year. This is the part where things get brutal, but before we get into the admittedly many tearjerkers, let's talk about the characters who deserved their bitter ends. These are the deservedly gruesome deaths. No matter how he went out, we'd say anything that killed player 101, Jung-soo, was absolutely deserved. This man was nothing more or less than a violent, sadistic psychopath. He made his final mistake by refusing to move forward in the Glass Stepping Stones game, prompting his lover Han-min-yo to go forward and oblige his request to go ahead of him. But she never said anything about not taking Jok-soo with her as the pair fell to their death. The only reason this death isn't any lower, despite being very satisfying for one of the parties at least, is the fact that it's one of the few that isn't visibly bloody at this point. We don't see the actual impact of the fall, but we at least saw the emotional impact of Min-yo's tiny dick insult, so that's better than nothing. Next up is a character we were hesitant to put in this category, player 218, Cho Sung-woo. Arguably the main villain of season 1 and definitely its most divisive character, Sung-woo was responsible for the most main character deaths of the ensemble cast. Well, as far as the contestants go. Well, the contestants who weren't Il-nam, look, the point is he killed a lot of people, alright? There was his heartbreaking betrayal of Ali, which could be argued as a necessary evil, and later on his cold-blooded murder of the already dying Sae-byeok, which I don't think even his biggest defenders would try and justify. Sung-woo would ultimately lose to Gi-hun in the titular Squid Game, but Gi-hun, being an angel, still offered to spare his life. life, willing to go home alongside his old friend despite all he'd done. But Sang-woo, unable to forgive himself for his own evil deeds, would poetically stab himself in the same spot on his neck he used to kill Sae-byeok, leading to a death that, while not too excruciating, would only give him just enough time to beg Gi-hun to care for his elderly mother. He might have gone out on his own terms, but this was still easily one of the bloodiest deaths in the first season. Now, speaking of blood, let's talk about the winner of Character Who Forced Me to Look Away from the Screen Most Frequently, player 111, Myung-gi. This was the infamous doctor from season 1 who helped the staff harvest organs from dying players in exchange for information on the upcoming games. This is already an incredibly depraved thing to do, and it added to 111's stress, a sense of guilt, and a serious case of sleep deprivation. After one particular difficult procedure, the guards would tell him that they didn't have any information on the next game, which would cause 111 to snap and threaten to murder them all if they didn't find the information he wanted, which ultimately would amount to nothing. Well, not nothing, it would amount to Myung-gi being gunned down by one of the pink guys and strung up like a Christmas light. Not sure if that was what he was going for, though. Up next, a quick mention of Deok-su's unforgettable sidekick and everyone's favorite character, player 278, is in order. You might remember him as the totally not lackey to Deok-su who wasted no time turning on him in the marble game. The guy was absolutely thrilled at the prospect of murdering his ally, so when Deok-su ultimately won, 278 decided to make one last heel turn by running away like a wuss, eliminating any semblance of dignity he might have had left at that point. If it's any consolation, 278, it wasn't much. And for the last of the deserving deaths, we can't forget about the legendary player 230, Thanos. Love him or hate him, there's no denying that Thanos was an absolute psychotic narcissist. He's like what would happen if 324 were both sadistic and charismatic enough to make it far into the competition. But he made a fatal mistake by harassing Min-soo in the bathrooms for voting to terminate the games. This would lead to an all-out brawl between him and 333, and as Thanos nearly choked the life out of his crypto YouTuber arch-nemesis, he met a slow and painful demise by having a spork stabbed into his throat, leaving him alive long enough to spill a pool of blood on his killer and even crawl after him in a fruitless attempt at revenge. Suddenly being turned into dust doesn't sound so bad, right? Well, enjoy the satisfaction of that last villain death. This last category is for the characters who died deaths that were as brutal as they were utterly undeserved. They are the tragically gruesome deaths. Kicking off this category is player 212, Han-min-yo. Technically, 212's death has already been discussed since she died in the same way as Deok-su. The difference is that rather than being taken out while blubbering like a baby, Min-yo made the badass move of clutching onto her former lover and acting as the anchor that would drop him into the pits of hell, or at least the floor. While a fall from that height would almost certainly be enough to kill her instantly, and the death was on her own terms at that point, Han-min-yo still didn't deserve to die. Sure, she was rude, vengeful, and kind of manipulative, but she wasn't anywhere near evil, and here she sacrificed her life to kill the most revolting person in the competition. I'm not saying Han-min-yo is a pure victim of tragic circumstances, but I am saying there's a reason why she earned that hero's wiki page. You go, girl. Speaking of tragic deaths that were on their victims' own terms, enter player 240, Gi-hun. This entry needs basically no introduction. 240's death was one of the most beautifully tragic deaths of the entire series, with Sae-byok's first friend making the absolutely soul-crushing decision to throw the marble game so her buddy could live. In Gi-hun's own words, while Sae-byok had a valid reason to get out of the games alive, Gi-hun herself had nobody. Her mother was murdered by her father, who was subsequently, but understandably, murdered by his daughter, who was now the accessory to hundreds more killings and the victim of trauma that would never leave her. In the end, she was able to open up to someone with no fear of judgment, talking about all her hopes and dreams, and ending her life by thanking her for spending those final few hours with her. I guess this could count as an instantaneous death, but this one's just way too sad to not place it down here. This is definitely the least bloody death you'll be seeing from this point onwards, but we have to mention Gi-hun's mother, Mal-sun. We mentioned her death earlier, as her struggle with diabetes was a major factor in why Gi-hun decided to return to the Squid Game in the first place, but after all of his hard work, Gi-hun came back to find his poor mother deceased in the home they shared, and honestly, if anything, this proves that a death doesn't need to be bloody to be absolutely brutal. Think about it, Gi-hun worked his butt off to get the money his mom needed for her treatment, only for all of his trauma and pain to end up seemingly null and void when his mother didn't even survive the week. On top of this, her diabetes was severe enough to the point where doctors were strongly considering a foot amputation, so we highly doubt this would have been a quick and painless death, unfortunately. Next up is the most recent death, player 390, Park Jung-bae. To think, this guy went from a forgettable character in the beginning of season 1 to one of the best characters in season 2, and look where it got him. He went through all the trials and tribulations of the Squid Game, though granted not without plenty of help from an experienced ally, and ultimately got shot dead right as he was about to storm the headquarters like a badass with his buddy. While Jung-bae's death was pretty quick, being shot at point-blank range right in his heart, his look of despair really sells the scene for the heartbreaking tragedy that it is. And Gi-hun's screams of anguish do not make it any easier to stomach. While he's one of the more minor characters this season, we have to give player 246, Kyung-seok, a mention. He has one of the most admirable reasons for joining the game in the first place, desperate to pay for whatever treatment was necessary to fight his daughter's rare blood blood cancer. But despite even being secretly watched over by Kang No-yul, who had a soft spot for his daughter, that wouldn't be enough to save him from his fate, which was being shot point blank by a callous guard who had no regard for him nor his young daughter. Love makes people do risky things, and in this case, Kyung-seok's love for his little girl cost him his life, and even more tragically, it cost that little girl her father. Getting choked up yet? Well, don't use all those tissues at once. Player 199, Abdul Ali, is next. Squid Game brings it with plenty of betrayals, but this one hit the hardest of the bunch by far. Ali was a man who prioritized devotion to his loved ones above all else, only joining the games in the first place so he could afford to take care of his wife and son. Given the bond the two had forged at this point, he had every reason to trust that Sang-woo was sincere in his desire to make sure both of them made it out alive, only to find himself on the wrong side of a dirty trick that cost him his life. The look of betrayal and somber acceptance on Ali's face is absolutely heartbreaking. And as brutal of a show as Squid Game was, they were at least kind enough to spare us from seeing this one, only showing us the repressed guilt Sang-woo was suffering from because of his treachery. But what this death lacks in upfront brutality, it more than makes up for in terms of pure heartbreak, especially when you consider that his wife and child will probably never know what happened to him. We've got a whopping 6 more deaths to go though, and if you can't tell by that number, season 2 was not holding back. Enter player 95, Young-mi. A close friend of Hyun-ju to the point where she even called her Unni, Young-mi was characterized by being a total sweetheart who, like any reasonable person, just wanted to get the heck out of this place. Young-mi was more visibly anxious about her situation than just about anyone else, which made her death sting all the more. She came so close to surviving until 333 stole her spot in the room after she was accidentally separated from the group, leading to one of the most heartbreaking deaths of the season, as her pleas to be let in were silenced by a single gunshot that took the life from her eyes. Yeah, and we aren't even in the top 5 yet. Okay, now we're in the top 5. Let's talk about the season's first victim, Mr. Kim. Even outside of the titular Squid Game arena, some of the higher-ups just can't stop themselves from playing death games with unfortunate victims. When the suit man catches Mr. Kim and Woo-seok following him, he quickly captures the two of them and forces them to play rock, paper, scissors -1, where the loser is forced to play a game of Russian roulette. Now, Squid Game is a show that is full of violence, murder, and occasionally even straight-up torture, so you know just how serious it is when I say that this was the most absolutely vicious portrayal of sheer unadulterated fear in the entire show so far. The pair are strapped to chairs, gagged, screaming, sweating, crying, and when the suit man gets bored, he decides to reverse the odds by placing 5 bullets in the 6 chambers instead of just 1. It all culminated in a terrified Mr. Kim sacrificing his life so Woo-seok might be able to live on, leading to a blood-curdling death to kick off a season chock full of them. Landing just outside of our top 3 is player 444. Don't remember him? Well, maybe this will ring a bell. Remember that badass scene in Red Light Green Light where Gi-hun and Hyun-ju went to rescue a player who'd been shot in the leg with only 30 seconds left on the clock? Yeah, that was 444. Emphasis on was. This series just loves to get your hopes up only to dash them right away, huh? After narrowly crossing the finish line in time to rescue their would-be ally, Gi-hun and Hyun-ju rightfully celebrated, only for 444 to get shot anyway for the crime of being a loser. I guess the staff's distaste for cheating is still stronger than their human decency, huh? Taking our bronze medal of brutality is a death that was both bloody and devastating. Player 380, Sae-mi. Sae-mi is one of those characters who lived by the equality over quantity rule of screen time. Sure, she didn't get a lot of focus, but every second she was on screen, she was just so cool, man. Taking Min-soo under her wing for no other reason than trusting him was awesome already, and the two had a genuine friendship. Even after Min-soo left her behind in the Mingle game, she was willing to give him a second chance when he voted to terminate the games after that round. Unfortunately, Min-soo would fumble this, seeing Sae-mi in a life or death battle with 124. He desperately tried to intervene by dropping a glass bottle on her assailant, and when that didn't work out,
well, I've done all I can do.
He just kind of gave up. His fear was understandable, but seeing him turn a blind eye to his only friend being violently stabbed to death was as infuriating as it was heartbreaking, and if that weren't sad enough, we get a close-up of her corpse after the fact. Man, I've got to start choosing my favorite characters more carefully, which is a lesson we all should have learned thanks to our silver medalist of brutality, player 67, Kyung-seok. Even if we ignore the fact that Sae-byeok had one of the most difficult lives up until her time on the game, being a defector from North Korea who was just trying to get her family back together in the South, her death was nothing short of an absolute tragedy even compared to those of her peers. After a whole season of pain, trauma, heartbreak, and scraping by through blood, sweat, and tears, Sae-byeok made it to the penultimate round, but not before getting getting stabbed by a piece of glass courtesy of the exploding glass stepping stone bridge, which was totally necessary on the designer's part, of course. She lost a lot of blood in this accident, doctoring herself just enough to stay alive, and it was only when Gi-hun pressed her about whether she was okay that she might have received medical attention. Unfortunately, Gi-hun made the mistake of leaving her by herself to get help, at which point Sung-woo took the opportunity to kill a girl who was already on her way out. Really, Sae-byeok hits all the same beats as the most tragic deaths on the list. She was desperate to provide for her loved ones, became a more compassionate person as a result of her experience in the games, and even had made friends who truly cared about her. But what makes her demise even more gruesome than theirs is the fact that she didn't even die because she lost a game or anything. She survived everything from the Midnight Brawl to the tug of war, even right down to the previous glass stepping stone challenge, only to die in an act of cold-blooded selfishness when she was at her most vulnerable. It's hard to imagine a more heartbreaking way to end her arc. And frankly, there's no single death we could say tops hers. There are, however, a large group of them. The gold medal of brutality goes to the organ harvest victims. If you'll remember our friend from earlier, player 111, there was a bit of a side hustle going on underneath the already shady Squid game. Organ harvesting.
Organs?
See, some players were unfortunate enough to survive being shot after being eliminated, and these pink predators aren't about to be humane and put them out of their misery. No, they need to monetize it, baby. So, with the cross drawn in blood, they send them to have their organs harvested.
Why, you're one of the healthiest little children I've ever seen, and such plentiful organs.
From the way some of these guards talk about it, it seems like having the victims be conscious during the surgery, or even to wake up to horror during the process, was a common occurrence. It may not happen to any named characters, but I need you guys to just think about this for a minute. These players were shot almost to death by the pink guards, only remaining just alive enough to watch as they were placed into caskets and sent off to their fiery dooms. Or so they thought. Rather, they were sent to an operating table where, too weak to fight back, they'd have no choice but to endure the unspeakable pain of being cut open, having the organs ripped from their bodies, and then, if they were lucky, dying before they experienced much more pain. All of a sudden, the whole incinerator thing doesn't sound so bad, does it? Dang, this show.